In this tutorial, I'll explain how to vary the opacity of brushes in just about any digital art application. Techniques like glazing, gradients, shading, lighting, and certain media like watercolor rely heavily on opacity, so it's an important property to learn. I'll demonstrate on a gray canvas so you can see this more easily. I will select a soft airbrush. This brush has opacity linked to pen pressure, so if I paint with this brush, it gradually builds up the opacity based on how hard I press. If I press lightly, the paint will be thinner and more transparent. If I press harder, then the paint will be thicker and more opaque. The opacity setting I choose determines how much opacity I get when I use maximum pressure. You might also have a minimum opacity property you can choose for the lighter end of your pressure. Usually, you can find the main opacity control in the brush properties. We can numerically enter an opacity level, let's say 50%, and now the brush will paint at 50% opacity using maximum pressure. If we set the opacity to 2%, then the paint is not going to be as opaque when we make strokes, and it will take more effort to build them up to full opacity. There's usually an opacity slider that we can drag or click on as well. Another way to change the opacity is to use keyboard shortcuts. You'll have to look these up for your specific art application. This will modify the opacity in increments. Many applications will even allow you to use the 1 through 9 keys to select a specific opacity. For example, pressing 1 gives you 10% opacity. Pressing 6 gives you 60. If your application has incremental opacity shortcuts, you might be able to program them to a touch ring if your tablet has one. I'll select the Wacom EK remote, and under the touch ring tab, I'll set one of the modes to keystroke, then choose the opacity shortcuts for my specific art application. Give it a try, and if the touch ring is too sensitive or not sensitive enough, you can fine-tune that. You could even use a couple of your express keys for this. Or if you have something like this loop deck, you can use the wheel to change your brush opacity as well. You might even have a preset opacity panel with several opacities to choose from, as you can see here in Rebel. Your art application might even be able to save the brush opacity with each individual brush variant. One of the most convenient ways to change the opacity of your brush is with an on-screen overlay. The shortcut for this varies, but if you hold it down while dragging your pen either up or down or side to side, the opacity of the brush cursor changes, which in turn defines the maximum opacity of this brush. Let's drag to set the opacity to around 20% and then lift the pen up. Now if I paint, I will get a stroke that is 20% opaque. Your art application might even show the opacity numerically on the cursor overlay. I don't often change the opacity setting unless I find that a brush is a bit too strong or a bit too weak. Typically, I build up opacity gradually using overlapping strokes, so I usually set my opacity pretty low, let's say around 9%. Now I can more intuitively build up the paint and create a nice hand-painted gradient. I use this technique a lot for painting skies. If you're having trouble controlling opacity with pressure, you may want to calibrate your pen pressure. See my reference video for a lesson on how to do that. You might even be able to jitter the opacity to change the values randomly per dab. This creates a nice cloudy effect. To learn more about jitter, I have a reference video on that as well. Advanced opacity controls can often be found in the brush editor section of your application. One thing that might get a little confusing about opacity is another similar property called flow found in many art applications. Flow can also control the opacity and buildup of your paint, but it often does it per dab rather than per stroke. As you can see, when I overlap a stroke with opacity linked to pressure, my paint does not build up. But if I make that same stroke with flow linked to pressure, then you can see that where each dab overlaps, the opacity builds up thicker. This tends to create artifacts that make your work look sort of sloppy and artificial. While this type of buildup doesn't work for this type of brush, it can be appropriate for others that you do want to build up when they overlap, such as markers or maybe even dry media. How brush opacity is expressed differs between art apps. Some offer separate opacity and flow controls, some combine them both into opacity, and some only have either flow or opacity but not both. To learn more about the advanced opacity controls, see my reference video about brush expressions. Opacity can also influence other brush properties such as distortion, blending, paint thickness, and grain. In the case of distortion, it might control the strength of the effect. The pixels move farther with a higher opacity. The strength of blenders might be affected in the same way. As you can see, I can either smudge the paint heavily or lightly blend it. For brushes that use impasto, opacity might be used to control the loading of the paint on the brush. Less opacity equals less paint loaded on the brush and a thinner, more transparent stroke. A higher opacity might give you thicker paint that is more opaque. And in the case of grain, building up opacity too quickly may cover the grain entirely. Too little and there may not be enough contrast to see the grain. You can see that effect here in Rebel. That's all for this tutorial. If you'd like to learn more about techniques for using opacity, check out my brush techniques tutorial.